And we are live. Welcome, everybody, this Sunday afternoon, October 8th, 2023. Special day today. I have a great guest. Everyone knows who John Ray is. He needs no introduction, but I just wanted to welcome him and welcome everybody else to the show today. John, thanks for coming on.
All right. Hello.
So John is going to talk today. We're going to talk about Shannan Gilbert's case. We're going to talk about Gilgo and just about everything else that's involved around this case today. So welcome everybody who is watching this on YouTube and on Kick. I appreciate you guys coming out and spending your Sunday afternoon with us. So before we get started, we have to all admit to the fact that without Shannan Gilbert, there is no Long Island serial killer case. We don't find the human remains that are involved in this. And we also have to give John a lot of credit for keeping this case alive for the better part of 13 years when really nobody else was paying much attention to the case. I mean, there was many of us within the true crime community, but none of us with the voice that John had in order to keep this case alive. And we're going to cover some of those trials and tribulations that he had today. So once again, John, welcome. Thanks for coming on today.
Okay, thank you.
So let's get into Shannan's case right off the bat. We know that she disappeared on May 1st in 2010 from Oak Beach. And we know that there was a lot of problems that have transpired with the police response to that. We can get into that in a little bit. And of course, the manner of death and the cause of death, which has been a sticking point for you and for many, during this whole investigation. Could we just talk a little bit about the day that Shannan went missing and some of the things that could have been done better, let's put it that way, from the police standpoint back in 2010?
Sure. What would you like me to talk about specifically?
So, like, for instance, we had the problem where we don't have the video surveillance that was actually taken. We have the response that has taken so long. And eventually, I'd like to talk today about the 9/11 tape also.
Okay. Well, when Shannan calls in on 911 in the morning, I think it was at 4:53 a.m., the place she reaches is Suffolk County. And Suffolk County operator asks where she is. She says she's near Jones Beach. And so they switch her to the state 911 operator because that would be state property. So the state police would be involved. And so about 2 minutes of the 23-minute call are actually Suffolk County 911 operators. And then the rest is the state. First thing to notice, though, is that Shannan calls 911, an extremely, and you can't emphasize it enough, rare thing for an escort to do, especially when they are accompanied by a driver. They have ways of getting out of bad situations normally in that business. She didn't take them. She took an extraordinary step. That's significant because in one way, if you want to believe the police's bizarre story, actually ridiculous story, that she was crazy, that she lost it, that's one way of explaining it. But if that's not the case, the fact that she did that would suggest the horror that she was facing. So we start with that. But the calls, back to the point that you asked me about regarding the calls, how did they originate? That's how it happened. There is argument, therefore, that this caused some confusion on the part of the police in the delay that it took for the police to arrive in Oak Beach. I'm not so sure about that because the two other people called 911. And that would be Gus Coletti and Barbara Brennan when Shannan knocked on their doors. There were other people's doors which were knocked on as well. Those people didn't answer the door or weren't home, but some of them significantly did. It seems that they didn't answer the door and didn't make any call, or if they did, it's not being given to us. In any event, Shannan experiences, I guess, the delay because she's on the phone with the state people, whereas Coletti and Brennan I take it that they were on the phone with the Suffolk County people. Um, and so maybe the interaction between those two police authorities might have caused some delay. But when Coletti identified Oak Beach as where this issue was taking place, so did Brennan. So the stall between his call and the time that they arrived is kind of significant because they don't arrive for at least another anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes after his call. That's according to Coletti himself. We don't know why that delay took place to this day. Or maybe the police do, but we don't. You also have the problem with the calls that the operators interfere in strange ways, in unusual ways, because they're not used to taking a call like this. So they're not very helpful on the tapes, which brings me to the tapes. As you know, I fought in court repeatedly to get those tapes released to me and to the public. Years of fighting. During that fight, which took two appeals, two separate cases, or three separate cases actually, and two appeals, and eventually I won. In those instances, the police made it clear in their paperwork fighting me, the police officer who was responsible for the investigation, in charge of the investigation, the entire investigation, repeatedly wrote under oath, under the penalties of perjury, to the court that the police had reason to keep the tape because it was an open, active criminal investigation, which it was not. But nonetheless, saying that, one would expect that they had the tape and wouldn't give it up. However, when the tape was finally delivered to me at my office here, once the police lost the battle, the final battle, and it was delivered here by Sergeant Portella, I learned from the sergeant that the police never had the original tape. All the while, they never told that to the court or to me or anybody else. The state police had the tape. And of course, the police, Suffolk police, should have had 2 minutes of that tape on their end of it, but they did not have it. And so what they were delivering to me was a copy of a copy. And when I turned to the state police and asked them for the tape, which, by the way, I had originally subpoenaed long before that from the state, just in case they did have it, and they refused to turn it over, claiming the same thing that New York had, that Suffolk County had said, rather, that they were going to obey Suffolk County's command about what to do with the tape. So when I finally turned to them and said, okay, it's time to turn it over, they no longer had it. Apparently, the original is missing.
Well, and then when you listen to the tape, I for myself have listened to it a couple of times. I still can't figure out a reason why that they would want to keep this under wraps. It wasn't as if it was anything that was actually, groundbreaking in regards to would hurt the investigation.
Okay, that I suppose your point of view, Joe, is informed by your work and your knowledge, that your inside knowledge, shall we say, your experience. But otherwise, it very seriously hurt the investigation, because when this case started I should rather say when I started in the case in December of 2011, only days after the remains of Shannon were found, I called a press conference for Mary Gilbert at Oak Beach. And in that conference, our purpose was to request that the FBI, kind of ironic and significant, that the FBI step in and that the police department step out because they had so badly bungled the investigation. Fortunately, I referred to the police department and their commissioner as Inspector Clouseau and a Pink Panther investigation. That was because days before Shannon was found, the police commissioner, Dormer, made an announcement that Shannon had drowned. before they had found the body. And of course, that made no sense whatsoever to Mary Gilbert. And that's why she asked me to come in and help her. So I did. And my role strictly and solely was to call this press conference, make this request. And I also followed it up with a letter to the United States Attorney. Everything was ignored. Nothing was done in that regard. The police marched right on. And as we know, they, for a while, shut down the investigation when Chief Burke was in charge of it. He had gotten appointed only a few days after I had held that press conference. A few days after I held that press conference, at approximately the same time, Burke was stepping into his new clothes as the chief of police. A police officer, a detective in the investigation, a homicide detective named Vincent Stephan, wrote me a letter significantly on police union stationery, not on official Suffolk County stationery. 2-page single-spaced letter in which he rebutted what I had said at the press conference. Highly unusual. Why would they need to do that? I was not significant yet. I was just, we did one show and that was all. So there was no need to rebut me, but they felt the need to do that and to do it in a very highly unusual way. As I said, on the stationery of the the Detectives Association. He was the treasurer of that association. But he had also been active in the Shannan Gilbert investigation. And here it is, what at that time was undoubtedly an open, active investigation. And he did something unprecedented. And for a guy like Stephan, who was a go by the rule book man, this is shocking. He revealed what he said was on the 911 tape. And that was evidence in the investigation. And here we have the police, as you know, telling us ever since then that they don't reveal evidence, and they don't. They keep it tight to the chest or to the vest, when it's a open, active investigation. They don't let evidence get out. That's their policy. Yet here they are, taking one of the most important pieces of evidence and revealing their version of what was on it. He wrote that he heard the tape and that I was all wet, and that Shannon was always at all times calm. Everybody in that room was calm. There was never any dispute. She was never in any danger, and her life was never threatened. That's what he wrote. So we had to accept what he wrote as basically the official narrative of the police department. And it was so for the next 12 years. Yet it's a complete lie. It's a pack of lies that are directly contradicted by the tape itself. So, of course, it's very important to wonder in a major police investigation like this, the investigation of a century, why are the police lying over and over, outright lying? That tape tells you that Shannon was not calm, that there was a dispute, several of them, that there was physical confrontation, that the other people who were there were not calm, that Shannon elicited a blood-curdling scream as she escaped from Brewer's house and ran away. And when I asked Lieutenant Byra, who's in charge of the investigation now, why did that letter go out, he said he couldn't explain it. So why did the police spin that false narrative from this? That informs this entire matter, this entire case, our discussions of it right now.
Is this the same letter that showed up in the paper too?
That same letter sent to me was sent by the police to Newsday. They edited out one or two things that didn't really matter, and they otherwise published it verbatim as a featured letter, with the block around it and all that, in Newsday. They did that. So in other words, that letter was crafted to be the official position of the police department. But oddly enough, they never said it was official. They put it on stationery where it wasn't deemed to be official. But it was their narrative. and no other narrative came after that. And so what can you conclude from that? Well, one simple thing you conclude is somebody besides Stefan was dictating the terms of that letter. And I suspect strongly that it was Burke. But I don't know that. I do know that what I know of Detective Stefan is that he's a play-by-the-book man. He doesn't break out like that and do things on his own. So somebody told him he could do that or should do that.
Well, we are going to get into James Burke eventually today, but I mean, it's not beyond the realm of possibility of anything that man could have been capable of. So, good grief for that guy. So, as this case is starting to unfold and you're getting more involved, and like I said, and everybody, we're kind of like glued to the paper, we're glued to the TV because there's so many things going on, and they start finding all these other bodies that are out in Gilgo now, and it's all because of Shannon's case. Like I said, and because you kept this in the limelight. This is, I think about this often, and we've spoken about this before. If you're not out there almost in the beginning, like almost out there weekly, I don't know how much traction this case would have gotten further into it. I mean, I really don't.
Well, yeah, I see your point. I mean, I think it's fairly obvious that the police, we know now, and it's obvious to us after the fact that the police were not going to treat these cases with the same degree of intense seriousness that they would ordinarily in another murder case. The lies told, first of all, about Shannon tells it all. They were spinning a story that Shannon died of natural causes, and that way they wouldn't have to investigate it any further. And yet Shannon's story is the key to the rest of the other stories. And they knew that, and that got suppressed.
And the medical examiner giving a cause and manner of death of undetermined, which generally means that it gets kicked back to the police department, and the police department then has to do further investigation to be able to provide details. But for them to come out with that accidental manner of death is, to me, I still, to this day, I scratch my head and figure out how they can have a differing opinion and be able to just tell the medical examiner, well, this is what it's going to be. Usually the medical examiner is the one that has to determine that and not the police.
Well, in this case, the medical examiner and the police became one department instead of two discrete ones, which they ought to have been. I say that because after that letter insulted me and it got my Irish up a little, and I felt some real connection with Mary Gilbert, I decided to stay on the case because of that. And so in that springtime, the medical examiner rendered her determination of the cause and manner of death, and it was undetermined in both instances. That's what they found officially. So we went to the autopsy meeting with the medical examiner, something which the medical examiner gives families, and as a matter of course, when a loved one dies, you want to go in and talk about the autopsy and look at it and look at their paperwork and so on. They do that for you. They are a civilian outfit. They belong to Suffolk County. They do not belong to the Suffolk County Police Department. They're separate and shouldn't be the tool of the Suffolk County Police Department. In this case, they were. They were the tool. Why? Because when we went to that when I say we, I mean to say myself, Mary Gilbert, her daughters, and some of my staff, we went to the autopsy meeting with the ME and that spring, and sitting in the room in 3 chairs lined up to the right of the medical examiner. There were 2 medical examiners there, the chief and the one who did the work. To the right of her were 3 homicide detectives with their arms folded, sitting in their chairs. And whenever I asked a question that had any poignancy to it, the assistant medical examiner would get up, go over, whisper with the police, come back and answer the question. Oftentimes she would say, I can't answer that. Now, mind you, I'm going to this autopsy when I have no idea about any of the facts or any of the issues in this case, other than that there was, they bungled it. I didn't know more than that. So if I knew then what I know now, the questions I asked would have been far more detailed and far more extensive. But in any event, the police were controlling that interview. The ME was acting very poorly as an agent of the police department. Why would that be? I've never heard of the police sitting in on an ME's meeting before, and yet there they were. And it should be noted that during that meeting, the assistant medical examiner who did the work, Dr. Simschild, said that she was going to take her very extensive notes, which were typed single space in several pages, and destroy them. I said, you can't do that. You have to keep them. And when I subpoenaed those records, they're gone, the notes. In those notes, Dr. Simschild describes what is on the tape. So I came early on to know from the medical examiner's point of view what she said was on the tape. And she directly contradicted the police. Her statement to me ends up being substantially accurate when we now know what was indeed on the tapes. So the police were sitting there the whole time saying not a word except to her about this whole thing. And it's just not kosher at all. During that meeting, maybe I'm skipping ahead too far, but Simschild admitted that the police had recovered Shannon's jacket, apparently found in or about the driveway of Joe Brewer, and it was missing. She could not explain why. They lost it, is what she said.
Oh boy, yeah. So I mean, there's some new information there that I've never heard of publicly. So that's pretty interesting. But you brought in Dr. Michael Baden. The family brought them in.
I did. Mike Baden goes way back with me. He was a medical examiner in Suffolk County for about 2 years back in the 80s when I just started practicing, and so I got to know him, just hello and goodbye kind of thing. And but it turned out that when I contacted him about Shannon to see if he would be willing to help us, and it would had to have been pro bono because we had no money. I was doing it pro bono. It turns out that his brother would conduct the autopsies with him. His brother's name was Bobby, and Bobby and I had played semi-professional football. I had played for the Long Island Giants, and he had played for another team. So we bonded. We knew each other, and so Michael was willing to help out, and he did, and he didn't charge a penny. It was very grand from a man of such high esteem, worldwide renowned medical examiner, to perform the autopsy. So we did it together, myself, himself, Bobby, and a reporter, Christina Corbin, from at that time she was working for Fox. And so we were able to convince a lovely funeral home in Rockville Center to allow us to use their morgue. They had a morgue downstairs, pretty big operation, and for a very reduced fee. So we were able to conduct this, and we were just basically looking at bones, putting out bones and seeing where they fit and so on. And so that's what we did. So when Baden came in, we found the hyoid bone. Now, mind you, at the autopsy meeting, the hyoid bone, they gave us a picture of Shannon's skeleton. It was a little teeny weeny picture, and you couldn't barely see the hyoid bone at all in the picture, but it indicated the hyoid bone had a dent in it in the report by the medical examiner. So at that time, I asked her, why the dent in the hyoid bone? Because I knew about hyoid bones and that if they fractured, break, or any way, get distorted, it's usually symbolical of or indicative of strangling. And so I asked her, what is this thing? It says there's a dent. She said, oh, it's probably some growth that she might have had in her throat, the 23-year-old girl, that indented the bone. I said, okay, I don't know how she would know that, but all right, there it was. So we looked for the hyoid bone. We found it. And instead, the hyoid bone, which is a U-shaped bone, okay, with two horns and a base, the base had a hole either drilled or pushed through it, circular hole all the way through. It was not a dent. That was a misrepresentation. it was a hole. You could see right through it. And to me, that seemed unnatural. Dr. Baden was more interested, however, in the horns. And the horns, they stick up like cattle horns, except at the tip of each one, there's another little horn that sticks out from that. The horns were missing, the little horns, and the big horns were, roughed down. They weren't the tips that you normally see. And so he said that was indicative that somebody had broken those horns. And he therefore concluded in his report, unlike the Dr. Sims child, who was brand new at her work, by the way, when she did the work, very experienced Dr. Baden said in his report words to the effect that the death was consistent with homicide and was not consistent with death by natural causes. So he not only suggested that homicide was the probable cause of death, but also suggested that the police story was nonsense, that she couldn't have died by natural causes. Now, you have to remember that the police story up until then first was that she drowned. Then when her body was found, and it was found laying on a bush, apparently with her head, according to Dr. Sims' child, her head was facing up, but she was found on loam in a bush. There's no way she could have drowned. So the police shifted then, and they said, well, she died of some other natural causes. And there's no evidence whatsoever that happened. Zero. So, by the way, they could have conducted what they call a diatome test, which is short for diatomaceous test, where they could take the remains. She had a mat of hair that was left. There was some skin left, and there's also a bone. And you could take the test even from the bone. And what it does is it tests whether or not she was drowned. They never did the diatome test because they know darn well that she didn't drown. The place where we found her, there was no water. Now they say, well, with Hurricane Sandy, the body floated up and landed there, or some other such thing. There's no evidence of that. Zero.
Well, and actually, she was found before Hurricane Sandy, right? I mean, she was found in December of 2011.
2011.
Yeah, Sandy doesn't come till October of 2012.
Well, I'm just telling you what they said initially. Okay, so they said she floated up. I mean, it's just the whole thing was absurd. They were bumbling about what their story was back and forth, and I mean, it's ludicrous actually when you think about it. Now, think of this: you're a detective with great experience, so I think you'll appreciate this. Here we have homicide detectives who get to where they are because they're so good. They're the creme de la creme of the police department. They get there because they are very good at one thing, and that is the use of evidence. Because when you arrest somebody for murder, for homicide of any kind, you better make sure that you have the right evidence to convict him or her beyond a reasonable doubt. Because if you don't, a murderer is going to walk and never be able to be held accountable again. So there's a great burden on you as a homicide detective to make sure your evidence is accurate and so forth. In other words, you concentrate your life, your vocation on evidence, always evidence. And that's their training. So here we come to Shannan Gilbert. And the police department, without a scintilla of evidence to suggest that Shannon drowned or that Shannon died of any other natural cause, claimed that she died of probably, and they use the word probably, of some tragic accident, is their latest position that they took on May 13th of last year. And they haven't changed it since. And no evidence. These homicide detectives, soaked in, immersed in evidence, have no evidence of what they're claiming. Why in God's name are they doing that? Something is very seriously wrong here.
Yeah, and I can't put my finger on it exactly, what that reason is, but not only evidence, but also pay attention to the details. and then the fact that the toxicology reports come out. Not a lot of people realize this, but the toxicology reports came out negative for Shannon, right? For any drugs or anything else in her system, correct?
That's correct. Now, you have to remember, and of course, you know this, that if she had taken a drug that night, that drug would not have made its way into her hair or any part of her body to be tested that was left. They just wouldn't have been able to test it. So there's no way to know that. But they could test her hair for drugs that were there, weeks before, that kind of a thing. So if she were a steady cocaine user or abuser of some other drugs, it would have turned up. She wasn't. But we don't know about the drugs that night. So what do they say? One of their arguments is, well, she's probably on drugs. What do you mean probably on drugs? Where's your evidence of that? And so, well, she slurred her voice. Listen to her voice on the tape more carefully than they did. And you will hear a woman who sounds exactly like she knows exactly what she's doing. She's at all times polite. That's not a crazed person. She's at all times trying to explain herself. She tries to explain her situation, where she is. You don't hear that. And by the way, if you know her family, especially I represented her daughter, Sarah, when Sarah killed her mother. And I know her voice. And I know Cherie's voice very well. And you listen to Shannon's voice, that's the way they talk. There's nothing bizarre or showing that she's in some way crazed or irrational or totally confused that from a drug. There's just no evidence of it. Zero. And by the way, the same police who worked so hard on this case, so they said back then, and I'm not criticizing the current regime at all, please note that. But back then, their work, they did not reduce the 911 tapes to a transcript. They were relying on my transcript. And my transcript wasn't great. It was good work, but we have better. They never enhanced any voice. They did no voice enhancements. How do I know? Because that's what Portela told me. And he told me that when I demanded what I had won in the fight over the subpoena. I had won the right not only to get the tapes, but to get any enhancements, to get any records, any transcripts, and so on. They didn't have any. How could you possibly say that and stand there in the same breath and say, oh, she might have been crazed by drugs?
For those of us just joining us, we have a Shannan Gilbert family attorney, John Ray, with us. We're discussing right now Shannon's case and Gilgo Beach and Oak Beach and everything else that goes on. So welcome for those people that just jumped in the room. So John, when we're dealing with so many different problems with Shannon's case in the beginning, some of it mishandling, some of it missed opportunities. Like I said, not getting the surveillance video from Oak Beach that night played a big role in this. What do you think about, what's your opinion on the whole thing with Michael Pack and the interviews and the follow-ups or lack of follow-ups that was in there? Because Michael Pack, for those of you who don't know, was her driver or her security that night.
Michael Pack was a convicted human trafficker, convicted of federal crimes, and had done time in federal prison for that before he encountered Shannon. He was a driver who worked for the so-called agencies. Agency is the nice word for a human trafficking operation. And the agencies had already sprung into being with the internet when all this was going on. Over the internet, you could now arrange for sexual services. You could even use your credit card. And these agencies did that work and did it well, efficiently. Michael Pack worked for those agencies. So the only one that says that on the night in question, he did not work for the agency is Michael Pack. And Michael Pack is simply not telling the truth. Now, Michael Pack comes into this case, therefore, with 2 strikes against him already. That he's trafficked people before from overseas, and here he is driving her. So Pack is committing a crime. And when we realized that Shannon came from Jersey City that day to Manhattan to meet up with Pack and then to go out to Oak Beach, they crossed state lines for the purposes of engaging in prostitution. And so that's a federal crime. And yet he was never arrested. Now, we know that if you arrest a man and you tell him, listen, you're going to jail for a long time, talk to us, tell us, what do you know? Oftentimes you get much better, more succinct cooperation from a defendant if you arrest him than if you don't. Or if you
Leverage.
Leverage. And if you don't arrest him for some reason, maybe you have a good one, who knows, then you investigate all the facts and circumstances surrounding him so that in the event comes that you do make an arrest, it sticks. So the police were supposed to have done that. The police claimed that they did that in relation to Michael Pack. They did not. One of the key witnesses to what Michael Pack claimed was his alibi that day was another driver who Michael Pack met up with after he abandoned Shannon. And that guy was the key to explaining Michael Pack's alibi. I spoke to that man, and the police never interviewed him. A kind of a key witness, wouldn't you say? So
Just
you can
about,
tell
yeah.
this whole thing doesn't smell right. Nothing about this smells right. It's not mere neglect. And mere neglect in a murder case is not mere. I'm using that word advisedly. But it's worse than that.
Understood.
So you see what I'm saying. So Michael
No,
Pack, he plays a key role here. And, do you believe what Michael Pack says? Well, Michael Pack says, I passed a fly detector test with flying colors. And that's the phrase he likes, with flying colors. Well, first of all, lie detector tests are subjective. It depends on what you ask. And at that time, what did the police ask him? Not much, I would imagine. But also what's not known ordinarily is that Michael Pack did not apparently pass the test with flying colors. Instead, he fell asleep during the test. And so they had to redo the test. Why does one fall asleep? Drugs, perhaps? You're being investigated and asked questions about a murder, and you fall asleep? It's kind of odd. In any event, so Michael Pack has real credibility issues in this case.
Granted, I never heard any of that stuff too, so that's actually kind of enlightening in regards to all that. Because I always say the people that are there at the scene, you grab them then. Like you said, that whole leverage aspect. And I said there's a couple of missed opportunities in the very beginning, and there was also lots of complaints, or so to speak, like almost like the misogyny going on in the Suffolk County Police Department, that they didn't want to investigate this case or deal with it because of these young girls and because they were involved in sex work. And that was pretty much the argument back then. And up until a certain point, I think that was actually a viable argument.
Still is. I think just in passing, do you mind if I note, Joe, you and I have not we've met and I've enjoyed your company, but we've never really exchanged information like we're doing now. And I hope you can see that we've developed at my end an enormous bank of information and evidence that is very useful in this case, most of which has never been garnered from me by the police department, who refused over and over to take evidence from me. But you can see, I'm not a piker. We managed to, do my job as a lawyer should in my work on the case. But the issue of the sex worker, the fear of exposure of police liability in relation to sex workers is real. And I don't know if it's gone away yet. Remember when this investigation began, Burke was already chief of detectives in the district attorney's office, where the district attorney Spoda maintained a little Praetorian guard of detectives from the police department, borrowed from the police department, and then working for the DA. Burke was in charge of that. That operation should have cooperated with the police operation, and sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they were at loggerheads one with the other. In this case, they were seriously so, where District Attorney Spoda was claiming that there was more than one killer, and Police Commissioner Dormer was claiming there was only one killer. I may have that backwards. I'm not sure. I forgot.
No, you got it right.
Okay. And so there may have been some competition, but there was a de facto leader of the investigation right from the start, and that was James Burke. Then he gets appointed 5 days or so after Shannan Gilbert's discovered, her bones are discovered, when the chief of police, Verone, is forced to step down and Dormer is forced out, and Burke, the pathway is opened by Spoda and Ballone, county executive, to make Burke the chief of police. So that was already in the works before Shannon's bones were found, but it comes to fruition when that happens. So all along, up until then, Burke was in charge of this investigation. And now he's de jure. He is, in fact, in truth, in law, he's in charge of the investigation after that. And yet he comes to the table with a predilection for sex workers himself. And that we know certain things are factually established. We know there's an awful lot of rumors about other things that he did during that time, but there's no question that he had already been busted in rank twice because of his relationships with a sex worker, Loretta Rickenbacker. I know Loretta Rickenbacker's situation because I became her lawyer. So Loretta was seduced by James Burke in the most horrendous way. I won't even describe it, but she was rather, and she was his girlfriend, his one of his girlfriends of many. She would have sex with him in a house in Ronkonkoma where they would smoke crack together, and he would also cross-dress as a girl. This is the chief of police. You might ask yourself, how in hell did that guy who gets busted in rank twice and goes down because of his relationship with Loretta and then comes back up and becomes the head of everything? How does that happen? How could that possibly happen in the fifth largest suburban police force in the nation and one of the highest paid, if not the highest paid? How did a man like that climb the ladder? What extraordinary magical gifts did he have that put him there? Or did it have something more salacious behind his appointment? Knowing the police, and I've cross-examined many of them over my 41 years of work with many homicide cases in my background, working on them and trying them in court and so on. I've also examined the police administrators in discrimination cases. And so I kind of know them backward and forward and try to pull a little rank here and say, there's no way that guy could have climbed the ranks, knowing what we know about him, without complicity on the part of the police that were promoting him on the way up. And that just isn't Spoda himself. Spoda didn't have the power to promote Burke. Spoda was not in charge of the police department. And when Spoda was in the, when Burke was climbing, Spoda wasn't even a DA yet. He was a defense attorney after he left the DA's office. So there were others who helped to promote Burke. Why? Is there a moral sexual problem that ran through the upper ranks of the police department? I would think so. I remember I attended part of the trial of Tom Spoda, and I was there for a separate reason, but I did sit in on it. And it was pointed out to me that 3 out of the 3 administrators who testified were all having adulterous affairs themselves. Were they in a position where they were compromised, and so Burke made his way up? These are all very important questions. And how much of that sexual atmosphere, sexual muck, touched them as well, such that Burke made his way through the ranks? It's very hard to explain otherwise. So we have that problem.
And we know James Burke back in the news again. He's got another court date. He was just there Friday. He's got another court date at the end of this month, doing whatever James Burke is doing these days. But we know from anybody who's watched this channel, we had Gus Garcia Roberts talking about his book, Jimmy the King, and going through some of those things too with James Burke. And it's just an absolute eye opener when you think about what was going on in Suffolk County back in the day.
Well, Gus Garcia is a good writer. He's a great former Newsday reporter. I knew him, and I spoke to him while he was writing this book, and I think he put me in there somewhere. But in any event, if anybody knows anything, it's Gus. But I want to add something else.
Sure.
With regard to Burke's latest round of his bust for soliciting sex from a man up on Bald Hill in Farmingville. And start out with this. I've myself had several clients who were busted up on Bald Hill for exactly the same thing over the course of years. Bald Hill is notorious for male solicitation of sex. And in fact, there's one of those stores that has all sex toys and things like that right down at the base of the hill, where some of them would hang out and then end up on the hill. Everybody knew this for years. It was like the rest stops along the Long Island Expressway, which were other places where this would happen, where men would solicit sex from other men and expose themselves. Usually that's what would take place. So Chief Burke, who was said in the disciplinary records of the investigation of him when he was having troubles with the Loretta situation, he was said to be an extremely street smart cop, really knew his territory better than anyone. They went out of their way to point that out in the reports. This extremely street smart cop would certainly have known that Bald Hill was not only a notorious place to pick up men by other men, but also that it was a place where you often got busted. In other words, it was a high-risk site. And Burke went there and took that high risk. It tells you a lot about, that fact gives a good explanation about Burke's psyche as he comes through the ranks. He's a big risk taker, and recklessly so. Maybe he wanted to get caught, but that's for psychologists to decide.
Certainly, that's for sure.
But think about this: this guy, cross-dressing guy, who had this predilection for all of these girls for sale, now is looking for men for sale. Might not that trigger the thought that we ought to go back, and maybe Gus should think about this and look at the John Pius case again and try to decide what the real motive was for his murder? Doesn't it open the door to ask that question? Because we were told that the reason for that little boy's murder, horrifying thing, I never forgot it, I remember it very well, was because he allegedly was going to rat some of these kids for stealing a bicycle. That never made much sense to me. Not even that they were busting into houses, and apparently Burke was involved in that when he was, with the group that did the killing. Did that ever really strike anybody as maybe not the right explanation? Is there a sexual explanation? Possibly. Now that we know this about Burke.
We do know that. Yeah, Tom Spoda was the district attorney on that case too. So we kind of cemented their togetherness from that moment on, kind of thing, and up until the time they both get arrested.
Yeah. So it opens that door, and then we have the cross-dressing Asian male. who was found dead in along Ocean Parkway, as well as one of the Gilgo 11, Gilgo Oak Beach 11. And that male died in a different manner than the others. His face was smashed in. So does that open any doors of inquiry? I think it does. More than that, I don't know. I'm not the police, but the theory is the theory that there's some more involvement here of people in that line of work and people who solicit them. There are real possibilities there that should be explored.
So with me, if you just joined us, John Ray, family attorney for Shannan Gilbert family. John, we're going to fast forward a little bit because we're actually eating up all the time.
All right, I'm sorry if I did that.
Oh no, this has been awesome. No, this has been awesome. No, I mean, this is unscripted. We're going to run with this and see where this headed, where we're going to head. So we have this arrest for Rex Sherman so far for 3 of the Gilgo 4. I believe the 4th one will be attributed to that. The question was, so you had mentioned before, Dormer said 1 serial killer. Spoda said more than 1 serial killer. Do you have a theory on how many serial killers could be involved in this? If you want to talk, if you don't want to, that's fine.
No, it's okay. Sure, of course, we all have theories, but I have many theories. They've been brooded about and they've handed to me by others. I don't claim to have an ingenious insight, but there are several theories. I don't subscribe to any one without evidence, and so like the police. I'm a lawyer who relies on evidence as well in everything I do. It's all about evidence. So evidence, always evidence. That's the rule. Sherlock Holmes said that, right? Supposedly. So in that novel. And so with evidence being, my command, I just don't have one theory that I ascribe to. Theories glue together evidence. And only when you're certain that they actually prove theory do you do anything about it. Nothing's been proven enough yet as to whether there's one more than one. But there are reasonable and unreasonable theories. And some of the reasonable theories are that, yes, Uerman is involved in the other killings as well, including potentially in Shannon's. That's a given. How could we ignore it? I mean, he certainly looks like he killed at least 4 of them. So, that theory that he killed the others as well, yeah, that's a viable theory, especially because he's a hunter. He also, from what I gather, was not only he was a passionate solicitor of escorts, of sex workers, to the point where it broke up his first marriage. And, I've talked to eyewitnesses who say that he was constantly bringing in sex workers to his home while his wife was there. And, he has, so is it possible that this guy who has a very violent streak in him and vengeful was somebody that killed the others as well? Possibly, yeah. He certainly had the ability to dismember them. He knew how to dismember a deer. And how to hunt. There are certain theories that are starting to, take the lead, but not necessarily. And that one is that for Uerman, this was sort of a game, a hunt that he was engaged in. And there may be others when we think of that. One thing about him, you'll notice he's a joiner of groups. And when you're on the internet in the dark web looking at child porn and also at snuff films, which we heard from, I guess it was from Rodney Harrison, that he was looking at films of death. When you're doing that, you tend to not be alone in that. You tend to the people I've known in this business and have sex abusers and the perverts, they tend to work in groups. They like to talk to each other. They like to trade pictures with each other. They like to trade stories. They like to rate the kids that they're doing or trying to do or picturing. And they join groups. They even fly around to meet each other. So very often anyway. I'm sure there are plenty of loners here and there anyway, but there's a group tendency. So what groups did he belong to? There was survivalist gear found, as Newsday reported twice, that the police inventoried survivalist gear in his home. Now that's a specific kind of gear. That's not just hunting gear, or that's not just, army gear. That's a specific type of thing. People who are into survivalism, they're not just your ordinary person. These are people who believe that the world is coming to an end, that they have to get ready for the Holocaust that's going to come, the new one, for the nuclear war, that kind of thing. And they go off into the woods and they build huts, and they become like super Boy Scouts. They become guerrilla warriors, and they do all this weird stuff in the marshes and in the woods. So Heuermann appears to be, if that gear belongs to him and not just, or just, and only to him, not just to him and his wife, but to him, he's a survivalist. Now, there are other survivalists involved in this case. One of them was Dr. Peter Hackett. And Dr. Peter Hackett ran a company called Survivalist Dynamics. And he worked with another survivalist who you can find on the internet. And and I know that because he testified to that. So it's an interesting fact that's out there, and these things need to be explored. So there's a tendency for me more to lean towards that there's a group than that there's an individual.
Interesting.
There's also a ritualistic aspect to the deaths, laying them in separate, 50 feet apart, one from the other, or whatever it was, and all in camouflage, the 4 Gilgo girls, and even the beheadings of the other girls has a ritualistic aspect to it. Look at the tattoo that
Peaches?
No, Jessica Taylor had.
Jessica Taylor.
And that it's not cut off. It could easily have been cut off. Instead, it's sliced up, and that's why the police were able to push it back together and tell what it was. Remy's angel. That looks like a ritualistic thing to have done. And was this guy setting these girls up for hunting them in the woods? It's an interesting question. I don't know.
Well, I always ask my guests this question, but you kind of already answered this. Is there anything that you can tell us that isn't really public now? And that was kind of it. But because I've never heard any of that kind of connections before with survivalists and the like. So that's actually kind of interesting in that respect.
It's interesting. I don't know more than that. We need more evidence to know more than that, but it certainly points you in directions.
Just one question that we got over here. I think it's a good one. It says, what do you think about that when Rodney Harrison said that there was only one investigator in charge with the case shortly after he took over, when he recognized that? I'm sure you weren't surprised to hear that.
I was surprised to hear that, actually. In retrospect, it's not surprising. But yes, when he said that, it had to have been Sergeant Portella, because Portella was active in the investigation at all times, that I dealt with the police department. And he's a dignified, decent guy and a good cop. But I know he wasn't full-time, because I ended up representing somebody else in a homicide case during the investigation of Shannon, during this investigation. And the chief lead detective was Portella on this other homicide case. So he wasn't working full time on Gilbert, or even on any of any of them on Ocean Parkway. Jessica Taylor, he couldn't have been. And then to find out he's the only active one, made some sense to me because every time we contacted the police, we always ended up with Portela, no matter what, and he was, he was a guy that he had his mind made up about what he knew and what he didn't know, and he wasn't going to bend. Maybe he wasn't allowed to. I don't know. That I don't know, but it was he who said to a former homicide detective who was working with me, a Suffolk County homicide detective, on the case, when that homicide detective went to Portela to deliver my summation of evidence I had up until that time, and I think it was in 2015 or 16, Portela said to that detective of mine, he rejected what we were offering him, the evidence, and he said, John Ray will get those tapes over my dead body. So he's still alive. And
Okay.
and I offered to have a drink with him because he's a nice guy, and he accepted. So, but there you have it. So I don't know. The truth is they had a war room in the police department at headquarters just devoted to the Gilgo Oak Beach case. But I think the war room became just a prop and became less and less active as time went on. The truth is, as well, if you remember, that the police commissioner, the woman, what's her name?
Geraldine Hart?
Yes, Geraldine Hart. Thank you. My age setting, remembering names. Commissioner Hart, when she was in and was going to do all these wonderful things and then didn't, the only thing she did was release a little photograph of two of the initials on a belt. Not even the belt, not even the buckle, not even any dimensions or sizes, just two initials. That was it. So how much work could the police have been doing if that's all they were willing to put out there with confidence to the public?
I remember that press conference well. Yeah, I mean, she looked a little out of place there. I always make the joke. I said she looked like me when I was in algebra class. I mean, just like totally lost kind of thing. You have time for one more question? I know you have to leave. You have another appointment.
Yes.
Okay. Where do you see this investigation going now with Gilgo Beach and as far as Rick Sherman and the search warrants and everything else that happens?
Well, I have faith in the good work of Ray Tierney in the district attorney's office. I worked with Ray in a prosecution of a corrupt lawyer not too long ago, and when he was in the U.S. attorney's office. And so I have great faith in him. He's a man of hard work and not dumb by any stretch. He went to an Ivy League school. He was a quarterback. He was an all-around good guy. And so I respect him and regard him. Rodney Harrison, the police commissioner, same way. We became friends right away. We've stayed friends. He calls me now and then. I call him. I'm worried that he might leave us when Baden goes as the county executive, because he was appointed by Baden. And then we're back to square one and probably going to get another standard cop, which is what we don't want. We don't need. So I have limited confidence in the task force. I have confidence in them, but limited by the fact that we might lose Rodney, and that would not be good.
I agree.
So
I agree. Well, John, I want to thank you for your time. I know you have another appointment.
Sure.
This has been awesome and enlightening. I hope you join me again sometime in the future. We can pick up some of the things that we didn't talk about, or if there's something new that comes out, especially in the next couple of months. I hope you can be willing to think about coming on again.
There's plenty new, but I won't go into it now. All right,
maybe we'll do it a follow-up, John.
All right.
All right. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This has been great. And everyone have a great day. John, stay safe, and we'll talk soon.
We'll talk soon. Bye now.